All right, let's dive into some D&D today.
Yeah.
And we're going deep on movement rules.
Okay.
It's way more than just getting from point A to point B.
Right.
This is about how movement really impacts, like, time,
Yeah.
impacts combat, impacts those epic moments that make D&D awesome.
Right.
You've given me some really good source material on this.
Okay.
I think we've got a lot to break down.
Awesome.
So players can dominate the dungeon and just outsmart their enemies.
Yeah.
Love it.
I think what's fascinating about movement in D&D is that it's so much more than just, rolling dice and moving your miniature across the map. It's really deeply intertwined with strategy, tactics, and even storytelling, and understanding how movement works can make you a more effective player, but also a more engaging dungeon master.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's start with the basics.
Right.
How does movement actually, work in D&D?
Okay.
Is it all about how fast your character can run?
So speed is definitely a factor, but it's not the whole story.
Okay.
Time in D&D is measured in turns.
Okay.
And each turn represents about 10 minutes of in-game time.
Okay.
So everything you do,
Right.
from attacking to searching for traps, even just catching your breath, takes up these precious turns.
So it's like every action has a time cost.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's where strategy comes in.
Right.
So imagine you're in a dungeon facing a group of goblins.
Right.
You could charge in sword swinging, but that might leave you vulnerable to attacks.
Right.
Or you could take a more cautious approach.
Okay.
Use your movement to position yourself strategically.
Yeah.
Scout for traps, maybe even set up an ambush.
Makes a lot of sense. So it's about thinking tactically.
Exactly.
And using your movement to your advantage.
Precisely. And that's where understanding the relationship between movement and turns becomes crucial.
Okay.
You see, movement is measured in feet, with characters typically able to move in segments of 120 feet.
Okay.
Now you can use 2 moves, which consume your whole turn to complete that segment.
Right.
Or you can use 1 move and still have some actions left over for other things, like attacking or casting a spell.
Gotcha. So there's a trade-off between moving quickly and taking other actions.
You have to constantly weigh the benefits of moving quickly against the risks of potentially leaving yourself open to attack or missing out on other opportunities.
I can see how that adds a whole new layer of strategy
Absolutely.
to the game.
And this strategic element becomes even more pronounced when we start considering different environments.
Okay.
For example, think about how movement would play out differently in a dungeon.
Right.
Compared to, say, a vast open wilderness.
Okay, so let's talk about that.
All right.
How does movement change when we shift from the confines of a dungeon to the wide open spaces of the wilderness?
Well, in a dungeon, you're often dealing with narrow corridors, tight corners, limited visibility.
Right.
In these situations, a character's speed might not be as much of an advantage.
Okay.
You might find yourself squeezing through tight spaces, cautiously checking for traps, even engaging in close quarters combat, where maneuverability is key.
Okay, so in a dungeon, it's not always about how fast you can run.
Right.
But how effectively you can navigate those tight spaces.
Exactly. A slow-moving creature, like a zombie, might actually be more terrifying in a dungeon.
Really?
Because they can easily corner you in those tight spaces.
Okay.
On the other hand, a fast creature like a carrion crawler, which can move 120 feet per turn, might find its speed neutralized in a cramped corridor.
That's an interesting twist.
Right.
I never thought about how a slow creature could actually gain an advantage in a dungeon environment.
It's all about understanding how the environment can impact your movement options.
Right.
Now, contrast that with the wilderness, where you have vast open spaces, varied terrain, and potentially long distances to cover.
Okay, so in the wilderness, speed becomes more important.
It can be.
Okay.
Especially if you're trying to cover a lot of ground quickly or outrun a pursuing enemy.
Makes sense.
But even in the wilderness, it's not just about raw speed.
Okay.
You have to think about the terrain, the weather, and the potential for encountering dangerous creatures.
So navigating the wilderness is about more than just running in a straight line.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Imagine you're trying to cross a mountain range. You could try to climb straight up the steepest slopes.
Yeah.
But that would be incredibly tiring and dangerous.
Right.
A more strategic approach might be to find a winding path that gradually ascends the mountain, even if it takes a little longer.
So it's like choosing the scenic route, but for strategic reasons.
Precisely.
I like that.
And that's where your knowledge of the terrain comes in.
Yeah.
A skilled ranger, for example, would know how to use the terrain to their advantage.
Right.
Finding hidden paths, avoiding dangerous areas, even setting up ambushes for their enemies.
That's fascinating.
Yay.
It's like the wilderness itself becomes a tactical battleground.
Exactly. And it's not just about mountains. Think about forests, deserts, swamps, even bodies of water. Each environment has its own unique challenges and opportunities when it comes to movement.
Okay, so we've talked about dungeons and wilderness areas.
Yeah.
What about other types of environments?
Right.
D&D is full of fantastical settings.
Right.
Real?
And that's one of the things that makes D&D so amazing.
Right.
You could find yourself exploring underwater realms, navigating treacherous underground caverns.
Right.
Or even venturing into other dimensions where the laws of physics might not apply.
Wow, that opens up a whole new realm of possibility.
It does.
Yeah.
And in each of these environments, movement plays a crucial role in shaping the experience. Imagine you're exploring a sunken city beneath the waves.
Ooh, that sounds epic.
Right.
Sunken cities are always full of mysteries and treasures.
Exactly. But moving underwater is very different from moving on land.
Right.
You might need special equipment to breathe.
Yeah.
You'll have to contend with currents and pressure.
Right.
You'll have to be aware of the unique creatures that inhabit those depths.
And I can see how that would add a whole new layer of complexity to the game.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes D&D so engaging. It's not just about rolling dice and killing monsters. It's about thinking strategically, using your environment to your advantage, and immersing yourself in a world where anything is possible.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the basics of turns and movement speed to the nuances of navigating different environments.
Right.
Is there anything else we should touch on before we move on to combat?
Yes. There's one more important concept we need to discuss. Melee rounds. These are essentially mini turns within a standard D&D turn. And they become particularly relevant when we start talking about combat.
Okay, so we're going even deeper into the intricacies of time and movement.
Exactly.
Tell me more about these melee rounds.
Well, imagine you and an enemy are engaged in close combat. Within a single turn. You might exchange a flurry of blows, parrying, dodging, counterattacking. Melee rounds allow us to break down that flurry of action into smaller segments, ensuring that both you and your opponent have a chance to act and react.
So it's like a slow motion replay of those epic fight scenes in movies.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that.
And this is where the interplay between movement and action becomes even more crucial. Do you spend your melee round moving to a more advantageous position? Do you use it to strike a blow against your enemy? Or do you try to defend yourself against their attacks?
Wow, I can see how those split-second decisions could make all the difference in a fight.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding melee rounds is so important for anyone who wants to master combat in D&D. It's not just about swinging your sword the hardest. It's about thinking tactically. Using your movement wisely and choosing the right actions at the right time.
Makes sense.
It's fascinating how those small time increments, like melee rounds, can make such a big difference in the flow of combat. But let's zoom back out for a second and talk about some of the bigger movement options players have during combat.
So we're moving from micro to macro movements in battle. What are some of the options we have besides just moving a few feet at a time?
Well, one option that can really change the dynamic of a fight is sprinting.
Sprinting. Now we're talking. Everyone loves a good chase scene. How does sprinting work in D&D combat?
So sprinting allows you to double your movement speed for a turn. Giving you that burst of speed to close the distance on an enemy, escape a dangerous situation, or reposition yourself on the battlefield.
So if my character has a movement speed of 30 feet, I could sprint up to 60 feet in a single turn.
That's right. But remember, sprinting comes with a trade-off. When you sprint, you can't take any other actions besides dashing. You can't attack, cast spells, or even interact with objects.
So it's a risk-reward situation.
Exactly.
You gain speed, but you sacrifice versatility.
Sprinting is a tactical decision.
Yeah.
That should be made carefully.
Right.
For example, sprinting might be the best option if you need to quickly reach an ally who's in danger.
Oh, okay.
Or if you're trying to break away from a group of enemies who have you surrounded.
Right.
But if you're planning on engaging in a prolonged fight,
Yeah.
you'll probably want to conserve your movement for other actions.
Okay, so sprinting is all about those bursts of speed.
Right.
What about when we need to be more deliberate with our movements?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned positioning earlier as being a key element in combat.
Yes. Tactical positioning is absolutely crucial in D&D combat.
Okay.
Think of it like a deadly game of chess.
Okay.
Every move you make,
Right.
every step you take,
Yeah.
can bring you closer to victory or closer to defeat.
Okay, I'm starting to feel the pressure.
Yeah.
Break it down for me.
Okay.
What are some of the key principles of good positioning in combat?
Well, first and foremost, you need to be aware of your surroundings.
Okay.
Where are your allies?
Right.
Where are your enemies?
Uh-huh.
What kind of terrain are you fighting on? Once you have a good understanding of the battlefield,
Yeah.
you can start thinking about how to position yourself
Right.
to maximize your effectiveness and minimize your vulnerability.
So it's not just about standing toe-to-toe with the enemy and swinging your sword.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Sometimes the best position is not the most obvious one.
Right.
For example, if you're a ranged attacker, like a ranger or a spellcaster,
Okay.
you might want to position yourself at a distance from the enemy,
Yep.
where you can attack without being in danger of being hit yourself.
Makes sense. Stay back, stay safe, rain down arrows or spells.
Right.
But what about those melee fighters?
Yeah.
What are some positioning tactics they might use?
Well, a skilled melee fighter might try to flank their opponent, attacking from the side or rear where their armor is weaker.
Okay.
Or they might try to use their positioning to control the flow of the battle,
Right.
blocking choke points,
Uh-huh.
protecting their allies,
Right.
or even drawing the enemy into a trap.
Okay, so there's a lot more to combat movement than just charging in.
Right.
It's about thinking strategically and using your movements to gain an advantage.
Exactly.
Like,
And to do that effectively,
Yeah.
you need to understand not only your own character's capabilities,
Right.
but also the strengths and weaknesses of your enemies.
Okay.
For example, if you're facing a group of goblins,
Yeah.
you might want to spread out your party
Okay.
to avoid being swarmed.
Right.
But if you're facing a large lumbering ogre, you might want to group up to focus your attacks and overwhelm it.
So it's like adapting your movement strategy
Exactly.
to the specific situation and the type of enemies you're facing.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that's what makes D&D combat so dynamic and engaging.
Yeah.
It's not just about rolling dice and hoping for the best.
Right.
It's about making smart decisions, using your environment to your advantage,
Right. Yeah.
and outmaneuvering your opponents.
I love how movement adds a whole other layer of depth to the game.
Yeah.
It's like playing chess, but with swords and skulls.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And speaking of ranged combat,
Okay.
there are some important movement considerations when it comes to missile fire as well.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Okay.
How does movement factor into ranged attacks?
Right.
I'm guessing it's more than just standing back and firing arrows or launching spells.
You're right.
Yeah.
One of the most important things to consider with missile fire is range.
Okay.
Each ranged weapon or spell has a specific range,
Right.
which determines how far away from your target you can be
Yeah.
and still effectively attack.
So a short bow might have a shorter range than a long bow, for example.
Exactly.
Okay.
And some spells might have a very limited range,
Right.
while others can reach across vast distances.
Okay, so range is important.
Yeah.
What else do we need to keep in mind when using missile attacks?
Another crucial factor is cover.
Okay.
Cover can provide protection from ranged attacks,
Right.
making it harder for your enemies to hit you.
So ducking behind a wall or hiding behind a tree could be the difference between life and death.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And understanding how cover works
Yeah.
is essential for both attackers and defenders.
Okay.
As an attacker, you might try to maneuver your target into a position where they have less cover.
Mm.
As a defender, you might try to use cover to break line of sight
Right.
or make yourself a more difficult target.
So it's like a game of cat and mouse, but with arrows and fireballs.
Right.
Are there any other movement considerations we should be aware of when it comes to ranged combat?
Yes, the order of actions is especially important in situations where missile fire is involved.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about initiative determining the order of turns in combat?
Yes, I remember roll high, act first.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, knowing who acts first can be crucial in ranged combat.
Okay.
If you're an archer and you act before the enemy,
Yeah.
you might have the opportunity to take them out with a well-placed arrow
Right.
before they even have a chance to react.
Talk about a first strike advantage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even if you don't act first,
Right.
understanding the order of actions can help you make smarter decisions.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you know that an enemy archer is going to act before you,
Yeah.
you might want to seek cover or move out of their line of sight
Okay.
before they have a chance to fire.
So it's not just about being a good shot.
Right.
It's about understanding timing
Yeah.
and anticipating your opponent's moves.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And all of this ties back into movement,
Mm-hmm.
where you position yourself when you move.
Right.
And how you react to your opponent's actions can all have a huge impact
Right.
on the outcome of a ranged battle.
This is all great stuff.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how much depth there is to movement in D&D.
Right.
It's not just about moving your character from one place to another.
Right.
It's about making strategic decisions,
Yeah.
using your environment to your advantage,
Mhm.
and understanding the interplay between movement time and action.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it's something that becomes even more apparent when we start talking about
Right.
the specific rules that govern movement in D&D.
Oh,
Are you ready to dive into some of the more technical aspects of movement?
let's do it.
All right.
I'm ready to geek out on some rules. All right. I'm ready to geek out on those rules.
Okay.
Let's break down how movement is actually measured in D&D.
So at its core, movement in D&D is measured in feet.
Okay.
Each character has a movement speed,
Right.
which is usually determined by their race and class.
Okay.
This speed represents how far they can move in a single turn.
So a nimble elf rogue would have a higher movement speed than a heavily armored dwarf paladin, right?
That's right. Okay.
A rogue might be able to zip around the battlefield,
Uh-huh.
while a paladin in full plate armor might have a slower, more deliberate pace.
Right.
And remember, certain actions like wearing heavy armor
Yeah.
or being affected by spells
Mm-hmm.
can impact a character's movement speed.
Okay, so it's not just about your base speed.
There are other factors that come into play.
Exactly. And this is where those environmental factors we talked about earlier
Yeah.
become really important.
Right.
Think about how different types of terrain might affect your movement.
All right, let's talk terrain. Give me some examples of how different environments might impact movement speed.
Sure, imagine you're trying to move through a dense forest.
Okay.
The undergrowth, fallen trees, and uneven ground could all slow you down.
Right.
In game terms, this is often referred to as difficult terrain,
Okay.
and it might cut your movement speed in half.
That makes sense. It's much harder to move quickly when you're wading through thick bushes and scrambling over logs.
Right.
Right.
And it's not just forests.
Right.
Think about swamps, mountains, deserts, and even urban environments.
Yeah.
Each terrain type presents its own challenges.
Right.
For example, moving through a swamp might be slow and exhausting,
Mm-hmm.
while climbing a mountain would require strength and skill checks.
So as players, we need to be aware of the terrain and adjust our movement strategies accordingly.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And as dungeon masters, creating maps with varied terrain types can
Yeah.
add a whole new layer of challenge and excitement to the game.
Now, you mentioned environmental hazards earlier.
Yeah.
Could those also impact movement?
Definitely.
Okay.
Think about extreme weather conditions like blizzards, sandstorms, or heavy rain.
Mm-hmm.
These can make it difficult to see, slow down your movement, or even make certain areas impassable.
That's a great point. I remember one time our DM had us navigate a treacherous mountain pass during a blizzard.
Oh, wow.
It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time.
That's what's so great about D&D.
Yeah?
Those environmental challenges can really create those memorable moments that stick with you long after the game is over.
Right.
And remember, it's not just about natural hazards.
Right.
Dungeon masters can also get creative with magical hazards traps
Mhm.
or even obstacles created by the actions of creatures.
So understanding the rules of movement is not just about knowing how many feet you can move in a turn.
Right.
It's about understanding how those rules interact with the environment,
Mm-hmm.
with combat, and with the creative decisions of the dungeon master.
You've got it.
Okay.
And when you start to see movement in that light,
Yeah.
it opens up a whole new world of possibilities for both players and DMs.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive.
Awesome.
I feel like I've leveled up my understanding of movement in D&D.
Good.
Thanks for sharing your expertise.
It's been my pleasure.
Really appreciate it.
Of course.
So to all you listeners out there, keep those dice rolling. Stay aware of your surroundings and never underestimate the power of a well-timed sprint, a clever flanking maneuver, or a strategic retreat. Until next time, happy adventuring.